I'll be preaching from our first lesson, that is Acts chapter 17, verses 22 to 34. In our Acts reading, Paul has been taking a bit of a tour of that college town known as Athens in the ancient world. And kind of like many strict religious people, Paul is not exactly thrilled by what he sees in a college town. However, the problem he has is not with what the students are wearing or with what people are saying. The problem Paul has is with what they are worshiping. After seeing a few sights and after getting in a few fights with professors, and generally doing things that Paul likes to do, Paul then stands up to give a speech, which is what chapters 17, verses 22 to 34 are all about. Paul's speech comes in two parts. The first part is in verses 22 and 23. And Paul starts off this way. Paul says, "I see you Athenians are extremely religious in every way." That is, what Paul is saying is this: at least you're worshiping. That's a good start. Before our story, Paul has gone around in Athens and he's seen basically every idol and every god they worship and every temple they've built. There's the temple to Athena. There's the altar to the 12 gods. There's the temple to Athena Nike. Better to cover Athena twice, right? Just to get our bases, you know. After all, the town's named after her, so you know. There's the temple to Apollo. I could go on for a while. But even the hill he's standing on, the Areopagus, is translated as Mars Hill, or Ares, the god of war. In fact, the Athenians are so religious, they are such worshiping creatures, that they have a need to have all their bases covered. So just in case Athena and Zeus and Ares are not enough, Paul points out that they even have an altar to an unknown god. Actually, I think this is really funny, right? If you think about this for a minute, right? They have this altar. Here's this temple. Just in case we've missed a god, we've got all our bases covered, right? Just in case, here's an altar so that we're prepared. And behind the Athenians having this altar to an unknown god, and behind Paul pointing it out, there's actually a very important point being made about human beings. We are worshiping creatures. We like to think about worship as something you attend. So worshiping is kind of like a switch that's like has an on-off position. And your worshiping switch is on when you're in the sanctuary, or when you pray, or when you sing a hymn, and it's off the rest of the time. So you're not in worship when you take your kids to soccer practice, or you watch the Ohio State game, or you go to the grocery store. But what Paul is telling us, and what the Athenians are showing us, is that we are, in fact, never not worshiping. The worship switch is always on. The Athenians are very religious because human beings are very religious. So at the Ohio State game, we are in fact worshiping. When we take our kids to soccer practice, we are in fact worshiping. And even at the grocery store, we are worshiping. We cannot help but build altars to gods that are both known and unknown. Part 2 of Paul's speech comes in verses 24 through 29. Paul says, "You worship this unknown God," and then he goes, "Well, let me proclaim him to you." And what's interesting is that Paul doesn't begin by talking about Jesus. He doesn't do the street preacher thing, right? My college, we had this street preacher who showed up. I went to a Christian college. You'd think we'd be safe, right? But there he was all the same. But he doesn't do the street preacher thing talking about Jesus Christ. What Paul does is Paul begins with creation. Paul says, let me proclaim this God to you, the God who made the world and everything in it, he says in verse 24. Since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things, in verse 25. In him we move and live and have our being. Paul ends in verse 28. We haven't gotten to Jesus yet. Heck, we haven't even gotten out of Genesis 1 yet. We're just at God created the world. If you go back to the whole Old Testament, you will notice two things. The first thing you will notice is that the word create is only ever used in reference to God. God creates. Humans can make things, they can build things, but humans never create things. Only God creates. Only God creates the stars in the heavens and sets the planets in motions and determines the exact mechanisms of photosynthesis, and only God calls life in all its wonder into being. The second thing you will notice is that Israel most often needed to remind itself of this creation faith when they were in trouble. Israel talked about this God who creates when they were feeling oppressed or hurt or lost, whether it was exile in Babylon or suffering the rule of evil kings. Why in those moments did Israel need to remember a God who creates? The answer is that what Israel was saying, what Israel was trying to remind itself, was that the God who created the earth could also alter whatever mess Israel found itself in. So because God creates, because God set the stars in motions and called whole galaxies into being, that meant a barren couple named Abraham and Sarah could have a child. And because God created the exact mechanisms by which photosynthesis works, that also meant that God could free slaves from Egypt. Whatever evil Israel found itself in, they believed that it was not so great that the God who creates could not alter it. Now, Paul's a good student of the Old Testament, so what Paul is saying to the Athenians when he reminds them of a God who creates, what God is saying, Athenians, let me tell you something. This God that you call unknown can actually save you. You worship Ares and Athena and Zeus and Apollo and all the rest, but do they have really any chance at changing your situation or saving you? And so Paul says, let me tell you about the God who set into motion the stars and also freed slaves. And let me tell you about the God who put lights in the sky and also gives hope to this hopeless couple. Let me tell you about the God who gave life to every animal that's on the earth and who also heals us of every dread disease. And then finally, after all this, Paul gets to Jesus Christ. My professor in seminary would have said this was a bad sermon. Paul would have gotten a failing grade because it took him so long to get to Jesus. But finally, let me tell you about Jesus, says Paul. Everything God does, the planets in the sky and the stars in the sky and the animals that crawl on the ground and every bird in the air and also every oppressor that has been defeated and every disease healed, it can all be assured because God raised Jesus Christ from the dead. And if God raised Jesus Christ from the dead, then no power of death or hell or any oppressive regime or any illness can stand in the way of God creating new life. So the only question for us then is this: what are you worshiping? We are actually not all that different from the Athenians. We're even in a college town. Isn't that great? It's like I planned that or something. Paul could stand here in the traffic circle of Hilliard, Ohio, and after he figured out how traffic circles worked, that's a joke, folks, he would probably start a similar way. He'd say, Ohioans, I see you are very religious. Like Athens, we have our list of gods that seem almost endless, right? Go to an Ohio State game and try and tell me, after you go there for a bit, that it's not a religious event. It even has its own liturgy, OH. See, you even know the liturgy. Luther is famous for saying that in times of distress, it reveals to us what our God really is, because in times of distress, we cling to whatever our true God really is. So like the Athenians, our list of gods is almost endless. We cling to politics as a god, thinking that if just our candidate wins, it'll return everything to right, or we cling to the idea of success, or we cling to hate and prejudice, thinking that if we hate the right people, if we kick the right people out, then everything will be peaceful. And like the Athenians, Paul is asking us if any of those gods have actually worked, and the answer is no. Working 80 hours a week hasn't brought us any closer to security. Hating people hasn't brought us any more peace. And OSU winning hasn't brought us any more true happiness. Okay, that one might be true for you all. What are you worshiping? Because instead of all our list of known gods over here, Paul suggests to us to start worshiping the unknown God. The God who created heaven and earth and all that is in it, the God who creates the world and can give you new life, because unlike job or school or the team or even OSU football, this God can give you new life. So today, let us set aside all our idols. Let us set aside all our list of known gods and all of them, because we know too well that they cannot help us. Let us set aside hate and despair and the false promises of success, and instead return to this unknown God that Paul proclaims to us. This unknown God who sets stars in their orbits and frees slaves, this unknown God who creates life and gives hope to the hopeless. Let us return to this unknown God in whom we live and move and have our being. Let us turn to Jesus Christ. Amen.